This episode is marked explicit and is intended for mature audiences. The conversation covers sexuality, issues of consent, and sex education. You're listening to Good is in the Details. I'm Gwendolyn Dolske, and this is the podcast where we learn what we didn't know in the spirit of Socrates, all with the aim of a happy life, a more knowledgeable life. We believe that intellectual growth is one of the pillars for happiness. This episode, Rudy sat out, but I partnered with the Ella Parlor. You remember her from our episode on marketing. She is the author of High Tolerance, and she has a podcast, Eavesdrop with Ella. I teamed up with Ella. She's not only incredible in her business, marketing, writing skills, but she also has a background in gender studies. And I am teaching a class, Current Debates in Sexuality. Now, because of the nature of the class, that it's current debates, I am still on a learning curve. And a book that I was interested in is called The Sex Will Be Good Again Tomorrow. I will link it in the show notes. I asked Ella if she would read it too and have a conversation about it. Don't worry if you have not read the book, you're still going to be able to follow along. This book really covers the issue of consent and presuppositions about sexuality and sex ed, and some discussion about sexual violence. So just a warning as you get going on this episode. I really enjoyed this conversation with Ella. She is absolutely fantastic, insightful. And for you, dear listeners, you're going to hear us working out these ideas in real time. I don't get to be the professor on this episode where I've got years of study behind me. This is material that I am just becoming familiar with. And I love thinking through these ideas and also learning from Ella and getting her point of view. Just one little side note. Toward the end of the episode, I am trying to recall the names of a couple of films, and I do an extremely poor job of explaining them. But the films are Pleasantville and The Shape of Water. Just keep that in mind when I do my attempt at explaining something from a film that was made that one time with that one actress. Just a reminder that if you'd like to support the pod, go to patreon.com. We've got extra content on there. And remember to check out our show notes for our sponsors. If you would like to sponsor an episode, or just shoot us an email, goodisinthedetailspod@gmail.com. Okay, let's talk about The Sex Will Be Good Again Tomorrow with Ella Parlor.
Yeah, it's really interesting going to Chapman. I'm really grateful for my time there. And I actually think that's a perfect segue to this book, just because that's where I mean that, because this is, my emphasis in school was human sexuality. So looking at sex and sexuality from a psychological perspective, a
sociological, philosophical lens.
Thank you, sociological.
Isn't this the best title for the book? But I think it's a quote from Foucault, but I was thinking that this is a really serious book. I mean, I'm just blown away by it, because I'm thinking that the topic of consent is really an either hell yes or a no, like end of story. That's the 4 words, and we've covered consent. That's what I was thinking. And then I'm like, how is this book going to tease out over 100 pages into consent? And there was so much in here that I had not even considered, and that she's doing this deep dive into, wait a minute, we can't even talk about consent unless we have an understanding of sexuality. And the fact that you have a background in that just makes this so rich for me, because I can't wait to know what you think of this.
Yeah, I mean, she had me hooked in the first chapter. I was hooked. I will say, because it's been a couple years since I've left university, that it really brought back a lot of these sentiments across, especially when you start talking about policy and law, of what does consent really mean, and how is it weaponized against us as women? This idea, because we gave consent once in a previous light or time, that now we are not given the autonomy to abstain in the future. It's wild. So the first chapter, I really thought to myself, wow, I wish I had this tool to share, because not only was I studying sexuality from various lenses during my time in undergrad, but I was able to serve the community, the student community, as a advocate for sexual abuse victims and a counselor to help provide resources. And I think that one of the resources that we aren't given is a little bit of a perspective on what consent really means and where sexuality comes into play. And again, I think a big thing that we see is shame. That's what we see, right, throughout the book, is this idea of shame being used as leverage to then justify various acts of violence. I really, really enjoyed most of it. I do have some pinching points that we'll touch upon later. But where did this come onto your radar?
I think that just when I'm researching for my philosophy of sex and love class, I'm looking at whatever literature is out there. And of course, this title just grabbed my attention. From the beginning, I was hooked because, like I said, I really was not thinking about consent in these terms, about these underscoring ideas. And one of the things that in the first chapter, talking about desire, and I've always advocated that women need to have a better understanding of how their body functions. We have poor sex ed in this country, that even if sex ed is taught, things like basic female anatomy, like the clitoris, is often not discussed. And I think that the reason why that's not part of sex ed is because we've made this error in calling it sex ed when really it's just a description of reproduction. And so the underscoring assumption is that sex is for reproduction. And there's a big consequence to that, because if you are having sex that's not for that aim, then it's as though you're doing something deviant or wrong. So the assumption is that reproduction is the goal, when it might actually be the byproduct, because the overwhelming majority of sex that is happening is not with the goal of reproduction. There's something else going on. So when you leave things out that's intentional, like female pleasure, then the reason why female pleasure is not introduced in any sex ed is because it would disrupt that narrative that reproduction is the goal. Because there's just this lack of understanding that it can be for closeness, vulnerability, fun, a good night's sleep, or a great way to wake up, like a way to connect with people or your partner, a way to understand yourself, that there are all these reasons that people engage in sex. It's not necessarily for that reproduction outcome. So when I've been advocating for women to understand their bodies and their desire and how it works, this book has really thrown me off, because in that first chapter, like you said, when it comes to violence and things like that, that women are weighing the expression of their desire with their safety. And that's what really hit me. That let's just say a woman just, she is expressing desire. Maybe she wants to be a bit adventurous. And because she is saying yes to one sexual activity with a particular partner, then it is assumed that she's saying yes to everything and that it is okay to violate her and that could possibly be used against her. That's horrifying to me. And so now it's occurring to me that there is a real cost to women expressing their desires. And when you think about it, Ella, we carry that all the time. No woman walks to her car alone at night feeling without looking over her shoulder or without thinking in the back of her mind of how to protect herself. Safety is always on a woman's mind.
Yes. It's funny that you say that. There's a story, deviating a little bit from the book, but there was a story that Dave Chappelle says in one of his stand-up comedies, and he talks about how, for various reasons, he had a wad of $25,000 in his back pocket in cash. And he had to take the subway at 3 a.m. after a show with all this cash. And as he's sitting in the subway, he's looking at people, these various vagabonds, we'll say, or shady characters at 3 a.m. in a New York subway. And he was thinking to himself, I have something all these people want. I have something all these people want. And if they knew that I had it, they would take it from me. And he goes, and then I realized that's what it's like to be a woman almost every day. Mm-hmm. And I know that that's oversimplifying it, but one of my qualms with this book was that it almost sounds like it is written for men to enlighten them, but we are missing. I think there was a notable absence of male perspective to kind of, okay, how do we bridge this gap of men don't understand when we talk about looking over our shoulder, because their answer is, well, but did you get attacked? Mm-hmm. So is this a real threat, or is it something that you just watch too much television, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that that's where, if we could find more ways to convey what is happening, because so many men, they want to tune out. That's what I was thinking, where this book falls short for me, is that I don't know that when we have as women talking about our experiences as women within the context of men, but then we're not having that male voice and perspective, how are we going to bridge that huge gap of understanding, well, here's where we are. Here's why we need more advocacy. This is why you have certain voices, such as you and I, who are louder mm-hmm. and getting loud, because we're trying to compensate for a lot of the conversations that are having behind closed doors. And I think one of my one of the dismay for me is when we as women are sitting around talking about our experiences with men, and then we're not bringing men into the conversation. And that was one of the positionings that I had when I was in university with this amazing group that we were a part of to advocate for survivors of sexual assault. Was one, it's not just women who are assaulted, right? We have to acknowledge that men are assaulted. We were also missing a queer perspective in this book as well. So not touching upon assault or the queer experience, but furthermore, looking at men who, okay, well then how can I be an advocate? Because I'm not even a part of the conversations. I don't even know how to facilitate these conversations because I'm not a woman. I haven't had these experiences. I have these natural urges. Not that it justifies it, but seems to be, and there's no way for us to quantify this, but I can't help but think, yes, there's a lot of socialization as to why men overwhelmingly are the assailants in attacks and sexual violence. I can't help but wonder where the nature versus nurture comes in. How much of it is biological to some of what they might be predisposed to beyond the socialization. And so if we're not having those conversations and bringing men in, I don't know that we as women by ourselves can really instigate the change that we need. And I think that that's where I would love to see, whether it's we'll say silly story that Dave Chappelle says, but the silence in the audience when he tells that story.
Yeah.
I think you see it hit men in a different way because they don't understand what it's like to be sexually desired in that way by someone who could truly maybe hurt them, or maybe they don't realize to it, even if they are, but they probably can comprehend and conceptualize the idea of holding $25,000 in their back pocket, knowing that someone might kill them just to get it. And that fear, even though he did make it home safely, that fear gave him a really good window into what we are thinking of every time. It's just the difference is it's not a concealed amount of cash in our back pocket. It is our existence.
I was thinking about that with a queer lens, and I was wondering if consent isn't an unusually heterosexual couple issue. And what I mean by that is that doesn't mean that it's not an issue at all in the queer community. I want to be very careful how I navigate this because I'm not. I'm straight. And so I don't want to speak on behalf of an entire group of people, so I'm representing them. But I would imagine that the issue with heterosexual relationships is that because historically we have just had this idea of manhood and womanhood and this dance of the man chasing and the woman being like, tee, like just kind of pretending like, oh, no, don't. Like any old school musical, for instance, has because I watched musicals when I was a kid. Like my parents, I had no shot. I was going to be a nerd. There was like no way out of it. But and my parents had me watching them, like Singing in the Rain and Seven Brides for Seven Brothers, Calamity Jane, all that stuff. If Doris Day, Gene Kelly was in it, I know it. So, but in all of those narratives, the woman is much younger, the man is much older, and he just grabs her and kisses her. So when you update this and be like, actually, women don't really enjoy being grabbed. They don't really enjoy being chased in that way or it's harassment. It's really a misunderstanding because historically men have been taught that like you provide, you protect, you're the aggressor, you go out and get the woman. It's a difficulty there. Whereas I would imagine in people in same-sex relationships, there are difficulties to navigate. But I don't know if that's there because they're not in that cultural context as much. Something that I think is really interesting is that in the kink community, consent is the foundation. Like that's the starting point. They'll sit down and they have a contract. They go over a list of do's and don'ts, what is acceptable, what isn't acceptable. And then the fun happens. But in heterosexual relationships, there seems to be this misunderstanding that when you are engaged in consent, that's somehow unsexy. It doesn't have to be unsexy. You can say yes in many wonderful, sexy ways.
Yes, absolutely. And to your point, right, I am also a cisgendered, heteronormative, heterosexual woman. So I absolutely cannot speak on behalf of an entire community that I'm technically not a part of outside of being an ally. But what I can say is that I do think there's this misconception that the power dynamic between men and women versus a man and a woman versus a woman, or someone who may be somewhere in between fluidly, is that the power dynamic shifts because of the change or interchange of a gender. I think that's where it makes it more nuanced. But exactly to your point, I don't know that it really matters. I don't think that the power dynamic necessarily shifts just because we're talking about a lesbian couple, that there can't be one who is dominating, taking advantage of someone else. And I think that our power dynamic absolutely transcends our gender. And yet, because we see a lot of the heteronormativity in, the headlines, in the movies, as you said, we have this concept of sexual assault and violence as occurring, in an SVU episode where some guy in a back alley in a parking lot is assaulting us. We know that that's not the case, right? We know that that's not how it actually plays out. But because we still have these ideals in our head of what that looks like, I think that's where we really struggle to have conversations about, okay, well, what about when you're in the bedroom and you're participating in foreplay, or you're perfectly fine having sex, you just want him to put a condom on? That's one of my favorite ways, because I think a lot of people can relate to this idea. I am so down right now. I am ready. I'm geared to go. Where's the condom? You don't have a condom? Okay, that's a deal breaker for me. I'm prepped. I'm ready. I'm wet. I'm excited, but you don't have a condom. And that is my deal breaker. And you don't get to just have sex with me now, because now the contract, if you will, the social contract that we've made has been broken. This is my parameter. This is my boundary. This is my expectation. You are not meeting it. Now consent has been rescinded. And this idea of, no, you already agreed. We're going to go through this with anyway. That's where it quickly shifts. And I think the hard part with sexual violence is that it is the only crime that is contingent on consent. So if I were to take your life, I can't go and say, well, she said I could. Right? No. We do this. I do this with her all the time, but this time it wasn't okay. And I think that shift is where it gets convoluted and confusing. But I found it disappointing that in 2021, we're not able to bring in a perspective outside of the heteronormative male attacker, female victim. I think that it goes a little bit beyond that, especially as we identify as a society, especially in Gen Z, as more gender fluid. Because I think it will get to the point of we will be able to say it's not men are the aggressors, women are the victims. It's, okay, you're just a shitty person. You are just a bad person. This is not about you being a man, because we know that most men are not, right? Most men are not aggressors and rapists, but we know, unfortunately, statistically today, most rapists are men. And so that's where, it's like, okay, but as we start identifying and understanding and leaning into where our gender fluidity is, then I actually look forward to the day that we would be able to remove gender from the conversation and really make it inclusive. But it's hard when we still have this idea of the power shift between male and female and completely leaving that out, anything outside of that binary.
Yeah. It wasn't until the 90s, I think when Bill Clinton was in office, that marital rape became illegal in all 50 states. And there was a congressman who was opposed to making it illegal and flat out said, and I don't remember his name, but flat out said, how can you rape your wife? That was just he was just literally confused that it was impossible. What this book is talking about is that consent is an ongoing conversation. Like with your example of if somebody is like all ready to go and then there's no condom there, then the consent is rescinded, that it is an ongoing process. So even when you're in a marriage, your body is not owned by the other person to use at will. That yes, somebody in marriage can say, not tonight, or I do not want to. I think one of the things, let me back up. One of the things I thought was so interesting here is that the author is saying that consent there's an opaqueness to it. And if you're saying for women to know your desires, and she's saying that's actually an impossibility because sexual activity is like a conversation, and that whatever you think you know at this moment, tomorrow or the next year or in 10 years, you're going to have a conversation with somebody else and you will learn more. So you learn more as you go. So to have 100% knowledge of what it is that you like or dislike is only what you know at this moment, which means that it's not possible to state 100% all of your desires, because you will meet somebody and in that context learn something new, but it's unique to that context. Same thing as conversations. They're never 100% the same.
Well, and something that she touched upon in the context of, liberation and going back to this theme of shame is a good example that I would give is dirty talk. So dirty talk has been a very interesting topic behind closed doors among various friend groups that I have. And this idea of how do you talk dirty? So this is we're talking about two consenting adults who just want to talk, in a, we'll say vulgar, all of that. If you Google how to dirty talk, because I've been curious, like, how do I sound sexy? How do I do this? I do not watch pornography. That is not where I get my sexual education. And so I'm like, well, how do you dirty talk? What do you say? And you Google it, you really can't find anything for free. Like, there are some sites that will say that if you pay, a certain fee, but just the fact that I can't even Google how to talk dirty to my boyfriend, how to talk dirty to my partner, and find ways to talk about the desires of sex because I'm maybe not comfortable in a consensual situation in the bedroom saying, yes, I love it how you touch me there and I love how you feel. I don't even think are very comfortable within the context of a consenting relationship discussing what we really desire. And I think that if we can't do it there, then in the same vein, it would be difficult on the other side to discuss what we don't desire. And I think that that's where we have a lapse in communication. And that's where maybe the message could get confused both from receiver and speaker. And I think that that's where, okay, how do we unlock that? How can we get to a point where we sit with ourselves and say, I can talk about what I like in the heat of the moment. I can talk about why I like it, where I like it, and so on forth. And I would argue that most of us aren't there, maybe regurgitating what we've heard. And so it's like, okay, how do I get comfortable saying what I don't like? And I think that's where the shame comes in. And that's where we have these conflicting messages of empowerment and stigma.
This episode is sponsored by Factor. What could Factor actually be? Well, let me tell you, Factor is a great way to eat healthy and take charge of your health and what you put into your body. Basically, eating better is easy with Factor's delicious, ready-to-eat meals. Every fresh, never frozen meal, so don't put these into the freezer. These are chef-crafted, dietitian-approved, and ready to go in just 2 minutes. You'll have over 35 different options to choose from every week, including Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, and Keto. I did the Keto. I could go on and on about all the delicious meals that I had. All 6 of the ones that I ate were filling and left me energized and ready to work out and go throughout my day. Also, there are more than 60 add-ons that help you stay fueled up and feeling good all day long. Honestly, what are you waiting for? Get started today and get after your goals. There are 2-minute meals, fuel up fast with Factor's restaurant quality meals that are ready to heat and eat wherever you are. Pancakes, smoothies, and more. Discover a wide variety of easy options for the entire day, like breakfast, midday bites, and more. No prep, no mess meals. Factor meals are ready to heat and eat. There's no prepping, cooking, or clean up needed. Flexible. Today is all about flexibility. We're working from home. We're working from here. We're working from there. It fits to your schedule. Get as much or as little as you need by choosing your meals every single week. Plus, you can pause or reschedule your deliveries at any time. Factor is the perfect solution if you're looking for fast, premium options with no cooking required. Thank God, because I am such a bad cook, I could burn cereal. That's right, I could burn cereal, but not Factor. Factor is the perfect solution for fast, premium options with no cooking required. Sign up and save. We've done the math. Factor is less expensive than takeout, and every meal is dietitian approved to be nutritious and delicious. Head to factormeals.com/details50. That's factormeals.com/details50 and use code details50 to get 50% off. That's code details50 at factormeals.com/details50 to get 50% off.
There was a chapter in here, on that also just kind of broke my heart, but just a misunderstanding about the distinction between pleasure and arousal. And again, she touched on this that, can bring about a lot of shame. And this is for men and for women, that Well, when it comes to women and arousal, it is the body prepping against harm. It does not necessarily mean that that there is pleasure present, but that arousal is a physiological response, like blinking. And men can experience this arousal as well. And it's so important to understand that distinction, because when it comes to sexual assault, if a body is having a physiological response of arousal, there is this shame as though that means pleasure, or that the assailant is assuming that it means pleasure. And so understanding that is really key to kind of get out of a shame spiral when it comes to something like sexual assault, for the survivor of it, but also for the assailant to mistake arousal as, oh, the person really wants it. So I think that that's really key too, because I can just imagine that kind of shame. If we don't understand how the body works, then that shame cycle is going to be there.
Well, and I noticed that she focused on the female arousal, right? She didn't focus on the men. She left that out. And I think, because I reflected on this a bit during that chapter, I think why she left that out is because then, let's say we have a boss who is showing us his erection, the same excuse of, well, I wasn't aroused, it was just a natural reaction. That's where I think it gets dicey and inconsistent. The same, we'll call it excuse. I don't mean to call it an excuse, but the same justification to say, no, she wasn't aroused, it was a natural response, can then once again be weaponized against us to justify, well, this is why my erection is perfectly natural and you just need to tolerate it.
Oh my God. I'm sorry. I just had a memory of where like that, something like that could have easily happened and how awkward that would have been and awful. Oh my God. Okay. I hadn't thought about that.
Well, and this is why I'm so desperate for us. I mean, here we are, right? You have Rudy and he's not in this podcast. So, I mean, here we are. But I'm so desperate for us to include men in this conversation so they can give that perspective, so we can find a medium ground of, okay, we need protection. We need protection. We cannot have, the law doesn't distinguish between man and woman enough for us to be able to say, okay, well, if it happens to her, then it is against the law, and if it happens to him, it's not. And so this is what makes, I think, the conversations and the education so precarious. And that's where I'm desperate to have a male perspective, because I am very much of the mindset of, I want to believe women because I know my experiences. I know that I have only been assaulted by a woman one time. You know, a woman came up to me, thought I was attractive and felt me up, and she was straight, but she felt that it was her right as a straight woman to come and caress my breast. This was when I was working as a waitress in Hooters. People will say, did you ever get touched? Did you ever get groped? And I'll say, only one time, by a woman. And she was drunk and she was straight. I was extremely uncomfortable. I didn't feel threatened as far as the sexual violence side, but it was very violating. And that was the only time I was violated, right? But outside of that isolated situation, I have been groped by dozens, if not hundreds at this point, men out in public arenas. I have been catcalled and so forth. And so then that's where my perspective is, men are the assailants, we are the targets. That's my perspective. But I also have to know that the fear for men right now is this idea of, I don't even know how to freaking get consent because a yes isn't good enough. And I think that it's like, okay, we're not speaking the same language here. And I would love to have more men on this conversation and then hear more about, on the note of shame again, men's experiences. You said it, that biological response. Well, because I got an erection, the person assumed it was consensual. But I was only 8 years old.
Yeah, that's what I think about with boys. Like I think about, the history of things that have come up about the Catholic Church. Like I think about that, about young boys. I think about what's just in the news now about P. Diddy's places getting raided and just people being taken advantage of, young men, and that it's not, as just all of the complications of these ideas of what it means to be a man when it comes to something like sexual violence just must be so complicated and so difficult. And I think there's a lot of silence around it. Whereas women have learned to be a bit more vocal, or women at least are gossipy. And I mean that in a positive way. Like, gossip is a way that we save ourselves, that we're secure. It's a mechanism for women to communicate. It's been turned into some sort of a nasty thing. But women at least will have a friend or a sister or a cousin, and they will say something to each other. It's acceptable. But for men, it's just not in the same vein. And there's a lot of silence and a lot of anger towards anything that is not heterosexual for men, and a lot of shame. And so I just can't imagine how complicated that is. And that's where I think I would love to have a male perspective. But you're 100% right. I mean, now that you're saying this, it's like, what is the male perspective about these things? Because it's almost like this defensive mode of like, oh, well, I can't ask a woman out or anything. She just immediately thinks I'm a creep. And you're right. We're speaking totally different languages. That's not what's being said, because women enjoy being desired. That's why, like, all of the erotic fiction, just, nobody can keep it on the shelves, or every woman's got it stocked up on our Kindle, all the erotic fiction, because they're all tales of desire, and women just love that. So it's not that women don't want to be sexual or don't want to be desired. It's just that nobody wants to be touched without permission. It's a totally different thing.
I will say, and this is where my total bias comes through, is that I think it's such a disservice to all of us that we don't, and I know that I'm alone in this and I'm the minority, but this is on my little island. I'm like, well, if we kept sex within the confinements of monogamy, I think that would eliminate a lot of what you just mentioned in terms of the P. Diddy's and we'll say the Harvey Weinstein and all this. This idea of we're getting to know someone and commit to them in other ways, emotionally, maybe even financially, before we connect with them physically, instead of leading with that physicality first. And I would say one of the reasons why I would encourage and implore men today to practice abstinence is to protect themselves from any type of liability. Like, think of it from a pragmatic standpoint of, do you know for sure that this woman isn't going to turn around tomorrow and accuse you of rape? Are you comfortable with that? Are you sure about that? Maybe take the time to connect with her and get that consent over and over again in various ways. Yes, I want to go on a date with you. Yes, I want to hold your hand in public. But I think once we skip a lot of those steps that get us to a monogamous relationship, and again, I know I'm leaving out the polygamous and polyamory here and group love and all these other aspects, but I can't help but feel like, well, maybe some of these concerns would be eliminated if they weren't happening within the context of a drunken encounter, last minute, unexpected, where it is a long haul of consent, not just in the moment. But this idea of we have built a rapport and we want to connect, but unfortunately, that is not the cool, popular thing to say these days. And so that's where the conversation, I think, goes awry, because we're not bringing it back to, okay, were we really built to have this type of sex, whatever that might look like, right? Were we built to have free love? And it's hard for me as a feminist to say that, because of course I want to honor anybody's choice and desire and all of that. But I'm also like, okay, well, the same way I can't eat crappy food every single day because it's not good for my body, the same way I can't just give in to my desire to have Mexican pizzas from Taco Bell, which is what I want. I know that I have to do the work to cook a good meal.
It's your lunchtime in Dallas, right?
Yes, it is.
As we're recording this. Okay.
I know. I might get Taco Bell now because I said that. And so it's like we're allowed to say, hey, I don't want to shame you for having the Mexican pizza, but we know that if you stick to these foods, you're going to feel better about yourself. And yet we refuse to do that with sex nowadays because it's almost offensive to position monogamy. And I'm saying this as a woman in the dating world. I have a partner now who I love and adore, but as a woman who's been in the dating scene, just the expectation of monogamy for sex is too much for some men to bear. They're like, nope, not worth it. And what I just think that's where it's like, well, if we could just maybe veer it that direction a little bit, we can then open ourselves up to, okay, tell me about your sexual history. I want to know who you are, where you come from on this front, because we're going to have different ideas, backgrounds, and so forth. And I think that that's where this conversation, when we're talking about sexuality from several contexts, we don't want to talk about monogamy. We don't, because then it amputates some of these other, ideals and agendas that we've developed through our liberation. And so, as women specifically. And so that's where I'm like, okay, is it possible to say, yes, sex is great, but let's keep it within particular confines to protect ourselves as a society, protect ourselves from all the myriad of complications that come with it. And again, I'm confident that most of your listeners, most of my friends do not align with this idea. Most of the men I've dated do not align with this, but as radical as it might come across, it to me just feels like going back to the basics of, okay, let's just learn about each other so we can respect each other and really amplify the potential of our sexual relationship.
I don't think there's anything anti-feminist about what you said about advocating for monogamy, because what you're advocating for is a real specialness and joy, that it is a communication that is between two people who have decided that for each other, and they can flourish over time. And there's nothing anti-feminist about that at all. So I think that point of view, I mean, it works. And you're right, because I think one of the things that this author wants to put forward is that sex and desire is in context. So it's hard to say just like one way or this or that. And one of the things we've done is we've tried to separate sex, I think, from all of the context of the social stuff, the emotional stuff. And then that's how hookup culture comes about, because it's as though it's like just an act, as though like it's having the Mexican pizza, that is somehow separate from everything else. But the real joy comes from that dialogue and that communication and that vulnerability with another person. And it's easier to advocate for your own pleasure and desires when you're with somebody that you trust. And so it's part of all of that. You're right. We have really strayed from monogamy, but and as a feminist, I always try to clarify that I'm not in favor of anybody using another person. So if somebody has several partners, or they're just enjoying engaging, I think as long as there is some sort of understanding and real serious, self-knowledge of what it is that you're pursuing, like, okay, I think that's not what I want for myself, but okay. But sometimes I think it's important to really kind of dive deep and be like, why do I want this particular type of a connection? Am I using this person like I would a sex toy? And also to be on the receiving end of that for men who are just, like all over the place. Are you really having a good sexual experience if the woman is just like a tool for masturbation? If you want to have a really good sexual experience, and that's the thing. I think the way that women describe bad sex versus the way men describe bad sex is wildly different. It's wildly different. For women, bad sex can mean that there was a tolerated amount of pain, things like that. Whereas for men, bad sex might just be like, oh, it just was too fast. It just was too quick. Whereas for women, when they're describing bad sex, it is so much more complicated than that. It's so much more.
If I could go back to college, one of the things that I wish I had thought the wherewithal to have is this idea of women being a dead fish.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea of dead fish, for anyone who doesn't know, is the idea that a woman doesn't move around and she's just lying there like a dead fish while the man is, to quote the book, right, fucking her. So this idea of it's something being done to someone else, which is also concerning, right? That narrative. I really don't like the F word when talking about sex, but that's exactly what the book talks about. The idea of getting effed or effing someone else. I wish that if I could go back and I would hear some of the guys talk about, oh, she's terrible in bed, she's a dead fish. I'm thinking, how did I, with all my wherewithal as a advocate for sexual abuse and rape and trying to create a different culture, not think to say, well, did she want it?
Mm-hmm.
Was she frozen? Was she shocked? Was it consensual? Maybe and I wish I had thought about, like, if you're thinking she's a dead fish, if she's not showing enthusiasm in the moment, why, and if it's bad, why are you continuing with it? Why isn't a conversation being had of, hey, you're just laying there, you're not acting like you like it. Do you even want to be here? But you just still kept going. and then complain about her being a dead fish afterwards, maybe it wasn't as consensual as you thought. And I just wish I had the wherewithal to ask that question, because it was a common thing you would hear men say about sleeping with a conquest. She's a dead fish. She's terrible. She's
Oh
a
my
dead
God.
fish.
What a self-own. I'm sorry. That is a self-own. If a dude is going out and saying she was a dead fish, he is just saying he does not know how a woman's body works. I mean, one of the things that's what I mean. Like any man who goes out and like, women just don't want it as much as men do, or women just don't enjoy it as men. That is a self-own. You have just embarrassed yourself that you do not know anything about women. One of the things I thought was so interesting in here is that a lot of the literature, scientific literature about biology, has assumed that women don't want it. And that's because all of this stuff was done by men. And there's this assumption that like, it's all about his pleasure, because the men were just writing from their point of view and probably not satisfying their wives or their mistresses. And so just writing like, yeah, women just don't want it. They're just for making babies. They're just the oven. That's it. So we are facilitating the baby making, but we're going to enjoy it as well. And women don't enjoy it. They just make the babies. It's such a self-own. And in this book, something I hadn't thought about is that this assumption that men desire it more because biologically they're wired that way. But when you look at the biology of the woman, it would counter that. Women can have multiple organisms. Women can have multiple orgasms and they're not tired. They don't need a break after it. They don't need a break after it to take a mini nap, grab their Taco Bell, and then come back to work. Men need that. Men are like, I'm not ready to go again, right? Mm-hmm. Women biologically are actually wired to enjoy it more. Their orgasms can last 3 to 4 times longer than a man's, and it exists over their entire body, whereas men are just relegated to the pleasure for 5 seconds down below. So there is actually no biological evidence that women are not sexual beings. We're like made for it. We got a pleasure button that has no function other than to experience pleasure. That's it.
Well, where I do disagree with you a bit is nocturnal emission, so wet dreams. And I've always been fascinated about this. So biologically, we as women can only have our gestation every 9 months. So we can have one, outside of multiples, which is more rare, but one pregnancy every 9 months, whereas a man can impregnate several, probably hundreds of women in that period if he really wanted to, right? And so that does give way to this idea of, okay, well, the woman, I think that would be one justification to say that men like it more. And if a man abstains, this is like for anybody who wants to write me and let me know how it goes. For when a man truly abstains, that means no pornography, no sex, no self-gratification, no masturbation. He will emit his sperm. It will. He will have a nocturnal emission and have a wet dream. Now, most men don't go 90 days without some type of pleasure or stimulation where they ejaculate. And so they forget. So we think that wet dreams are relegated only to younger men. That is not true. That is not true at all. It's just that most men don't go 90 days without some type of sexual interaction. And we as women do not have that same emission. We do ejaculate, we know that, but we do not have that same nocturnal emission. And I think that that's where I struggle with the abstinence conversation, where I'm like, okay, I do believe really we should wait till marriage, more ideally marriage. But then I'm like, but why is it that this nocturnal emission comes in? Like if they don't ejaculate somewhere, they will be forced to through no fault of their own while they're sleeping. I find that very interesting. And so I don't think it's to say that one wants it more than the other. I do think we have to accept that we are just so wired differently, and we have to honor and respect that we all want it. We just want it, need it in different ways. And that's why we have to come together. I think it's beautiful that we're different and that we have to come together. And even within a lesbian relationship, right, we know that for clitoral stimulation, that doesn't work for all women. Sometimes we need the vaginal stimulation. So even within among us women, how we are pleasured isn't always confined to the clitoris. And so this is where it is incumbent upon all of us to open dialogue, know our bodies. I wish this book, I keep saying I wish, it probably would have been 500,000 pages if I allowed it. We don't talk about self-gratification at all in this book as well. We completely miss that. And I think it's such a touchy, hot topic, but yet
No
Again,
pun
behind
intended.
closed doors. It's really interesting. It's always intended with me.
There's only 2 films that I can think of, and I learned this from a psychology prof from Cal State LA, where there is a positive view of women and self-gratification. And I've already forgotten the name of the 2 films, but there are only 2 films. One was a film with Reese Witherspoon. It was like where half of it was in black and white, half of it was in color, and she's kind of teaching her mom that there is a way for her mom to be satisfied. It's like she goes back into the 1950s or something like that. I don't know how to explain it, but it was a positive scene of a woman in a bathtub, and you could tell what was going on. And then outside, a tree lights on fire, and this woman is understanding her own pleasure for the first time in her life, and she's well into middle age. And then there was another film that was kind of like this sci-fi film that was made by a Spanish director where there was a woman in a bathtub alone. But those are the only 2 instances where it's showing women doing this, and that it is actually done in a positive light where there's no shame at all, but just like it just is.
Even Sex and the City, it was so interesting revisiting Sex and the City a couple years ago and binge watching from episode 1 to the last episode to the series finale, was that it felt so revolutionary at the time, in the late 90s and the early 2000s. And yet there still is that, oh, Samantha, because she masturbates, she's wild, she's promiscuous, and it gets conflated with this idea of reckless, meaningless, vulgar sex. And it's almost perpetuating in this liberation, which I will say I love that series, but rewatching it 20 years later, there were so many misses. Again, no diverse perspective, right? Like, we just know that. You can look at the 4 stars of the show and know that it really lacks diversity. The queer perspective shows up in very, embarrassing ways a lot of the times, especially when we look at the episode with trans women and Samantha. But I think even that, it's perpetuating this idea of, oh, okay, and they don't talk about sexual violence and assault. It's this whole show about sex and liberation, and yet none of them ever experience, deep violence. And then who would it be? Would it be the Charlotte who everyone just runs to her rescue, or the Samantha where we don't really feel that bad for her because she must have... It's very fascinating to rewatch the series and think, wow, at one time we really thought this was like a total feminist show. And then I'm like, maybe it was a little... And for the time it was. But, of course, nothing's going to be perfect, especially in entertainment. I have to say again, I really, really did, not focusing so much on the misses here. I really, really loved how she put this book together. The scientific studies, as you touched upon, and the resources, again, to your point, overwhelmingly written by men. And I think just vulnerability in general is something that we need to lean into of all aspects of life, like not even just in sexuality, right? And allowing men to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
Brene Brown in a TEDx did a study on men and their most vulnerable moment, and these men overwhelmingly said that the most vulnerable moment that they have is trying to seduce or initiate sex with their wives. That is when men feel the most vulnerable, and I think there's something to be learned about the difference, because I don't know that we necessarily feel as vulnerable when being seduced by our consenting, from a consensual standpoint, partner, and yet in a consensual relationship, that's when they feel the most vulnerable. And I think there's something there to explore in terms of men and their ability and their space, the safe space to be vulnerable.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that, you touched on it with when you started talking about monogamy and how to, that monogamy or advocating for that or talking about the wonderful aspect of that could actually remove a lot of issues. And you gave the example of what if a man is warned that, oh, if you sleep with this woman tomorrow, she could turn around and accuse you. And that really hit me. And then also this idea of vulnerability is that women have this understanding that that there is a potential serious cost, like assault, violence, death, disease. We have that. It talks about it a lot when it comes to women and sex. We are given just a ton of warning signs or unwanted pregnancy, right? So we have all of these ideas wrapped up with sex as though there is a big cost and the benefit is But for men, there hasn't really been an associated cost for them with understanding sexuality. And so I think the reason why the consent issue is difficult for a lot of heterosexual men is because we're introducing, hey, there is a cost to this behavior. I don't think we have to look at vulnerability as a cost, but it does go against the masculine narrative, right? To be open and vulnerable and describing what it is that you want and how can you please somebody else. It's not just about you, but it's like, it's a dance, right? Between people. It's a dance. You work together. It's not one person doing something to the other person. I think that I love what you're saying, that like, hey, let's have more of the male perspective here. Let's understand queer relationships as well, how that works into this, navigating, the power dynamics. I mean, gosh, would you recommend this book?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. I really, really would. I think it would be hard. I don't know if it's digestible for a man who is just learning and leaning into feminism for the first time. That might be a baptism by fire, but absolutely. For anybody who needs to reaffirm their beliefs, or for any person who has been struggling with talking about sex and just struggling with the shame and the vulnerability, and this didn't feel right, it felt off, but was it? I think that gray area that we find ourselves in, absolutely, this book can articulate a lot of why it's such a complex topic.
Okay, that's a wrap. That's a wrap. Good is in the Details is produced by Dr. Gwendolyn Dolske and Rudy Sallow. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please scroll down to the bottom and hit that 5-star review. Remember to check us out on Instagram, Good is in the Details Pod. Much thanks to Ella Parlor for doing this episode with me. We're going to do another book club chat hopefully soon. Remember to check out her podcast as well. I'm going to link that in the show notes, and definitely get a copy of this woman's book. It is fantastic. Next up, we have an interview with Robert Seid. It's all going to be about justice and a lawyer's quest for justice, the American lawyer Stephen Bright. And until next time, bye.